The Muqaddimah Chapter 2 Part 2 and Chapter 3 Part 1. As long as a nation retains its group feeling, royal authority that disappears in one branch will, of necessity, pass to some other branch of the same nation. The reason for this is that the members of a particular nation obtain royal authority only after proving their forcefulness and finding other nations obedient to them. Only a few are then singled out to become the actual rulers and to be directly connected with the throne. It could not be all of them, because there is not enough room for all to compete for leadership, and because the existence of jealousy cuts short the aspirations of many of those who aspire to high office. Those who are singled out to support the dynasty indulge in a life of ease and sink into luxury and plenty. They make servants of their fellows and contemporaries and use them to further the various interests and enterprises of the dynasty. Those who are far away from the government and who are thus prevented from having a share in it, remain in the shadow of the dynastic power. They share in it by virtue of their descent, but they are not affected by senility, because they remain far from the life of luxury and the things that produce luxury. The passing days get the upper hand over the original group in power. Their prowess disappears as the result of senility. The duties of the dynasty make them soft 128-time feasts on them, as their energy is exhausted by well-being and their vigor drained by the nature of luxury. They reach their limit, the limit that is set by the nature of human urbanizatio, tamadu, and political superiority. Like the silkworm that spins and then, in turn, finds its end amidst the threads itself has spun 128. At that moment, the group feeling of other people, within the same nation, is strong. Their force cannot be broken. Their emblem is recognized to be victorious. As a result, their hopes of achieving royal authority, from which they had been kept until now by a superior power within their own group, are high. Their superiority is recognized, and, therefore, no one disputes their claim to royal authority. They seize power. It becomes theirs. Then, they have the same experience their predecessors had, at the hands of those other groups within the nation that remain away from the government. Royal authority thus continues in a particular nation until the force of the group feeling of that nation is broken and gone, or until all its groups have ceased to exist. That is how God proceeds with regard to life in this world. And the other world, according to your Lord, belongs to those who fear God. 129. This can be illustrated by what happened among the nations. When the royal authority of Ad was wiped out, their brethren, the Thamud, took over. They were succeeded, in turn, by their brethren, the Amalekites. The Amalekites were succeeded by their brethren, the Himyar. The Himyar were succeeded by their brethren, the Tubas, who belonged to the Himyar. They, likewise, were succeeded by the Adhwa 130. Then, the Muda came to power. The same was the case with the Persians. When the Qaid 131 rule was wiped out, the Sasanians ruled after them. Eventually, God permitted them all to be destroyed by the Muslims. The same was also the case with the Greeks. Their rule was wiped out and transferred to their brethren, the Romans. The same was the case with the Berbers in the Maghrib. When the rule of their first rulers, the Maghrawa and the Kutimur, was wiped out, it went to the Sahaja. Then it went to the veiled Sahaja, then to the Mazmuda, and then to the still remaining Zata groups. This is how God proceeds with his servants and creatures. All this has its origin in group feeling, which differs in the different groups. Luxury wears out the royal authority and overthrows it, as we shall mention later on. 132 When a dynasty is wiped out, the power is taken away from the members of that dynasty by those people whose group feeling has a share in the established group feeling. Since it is recognized that submission and subservience by others belong to the established group feeling, and since people are used to the fact that the established group feeling has superiority over all other group feelings, the same group feeling now exists only in those people who are closely related to the outgoing dynasty, because group feeling is proportionate to the degree of relationship. It goes on that way until, eventually, a great change takes place in the world, such as the transformation of a religion, or the disappearance of a civilization, or something else willed by the power of God. Then, royal authority is transferred from one group to another to the one that God permits to effect that change. This happened to the Muda. They gained superiority over nations and dynasties, and took power away from all the people of the world, after having themselves been kept out of power for ages. 22. The vanquished always want to imitate the victor. In his distinctive mark, his dress, his occupation, and all his other conditions and customs. The 133 reason for this is that the soul always sees perfection in the person who is superior to it and to whom it is subservient. It considers him perfect, either because the respect it has for him impresses it, or because it erroneously assumes that its own subservience to him is not due to the nature of defeat but to the perfection of the victor. If that erroneous assumption fixes itself in the soul, it becomes a firm belief. The soul, then, adopts all the manners of the victor and assimilates itself to him. This, then, is imitation. Or, the soul may possibly think that the superiority of the victor is not the result of his group feeling or great fortitude, but of his customs and manners. This also would be an erroneous concept of superiority, and, the consequence, would be the same as in the former case. Therefore, the vanquished can always be observed to assimilate themselves to the victor in the use and style of dress, mounts, and weapons, indeed, in everything. In this connection, one may compare how children constantly imitate their fathers. They do that only because they see perfection in them. One may also compare how almost everywhere people are dominated, in the matter of fashion, by the dress of the militia and the government forces, because they are ruled by them. This goes so far that a nation dominated by another, neighboring nation will show a great deal of assimilation and imitation. At this time, this is the case in Spain. The Spaniards are found to assimilate themselves to the Galician nations in their dress, their emblems, and most of their customs and conditions. This goes so far that they even draw pictures on the walls and have them in buildings and houses. The intelligent observer will draw from this the conclusion that it is a sign of domination by others. God has the power to command 134. In this light, one should understand the secret of the saying, the common people follow the religion of the ruler. 135. This saying belongs to the subject under discussion. The ruler dominates those under him. His subjects imitate him, because they see perfection in him, exactly as children imitate their parents, or students their teachers. God is wise and knowing. 23. A nation that has been defeated and come under the rule of another nation will quickly perish. The 136 reason for this may possibly lie in the apathy that comes over people when they lose control of their own affairs and, through enslavement, become the instrument of others and dependent upon them. Hope diminishes and weakens. Now, propagation and an increase in civilization, population, take place only as the result of strong hope and of the energy that hope creates in the animal powers of man. When hope and the things it stimulates are gone through apathy, and when group feeling has disappeared under the impact of defeat, civilization decreases and business and other activities stop. With their strength dwindling under the impact of defeat, people become unable to defend themselves. They become the victims of anyone who tries to dominate them, and a prey to anyone who has the appetite. It makes no difference whether they have already reached the limit of their royal authority or not. Here, we possibly learn another secret, namely, that man is a natural leader by virtue of the fact that he has been made a representative of God on earth. When a leader is deprived of his leadership and prevented from exercising all his powers, he becomes apathetic, even down to such matters as food and drink. This is in the human character. A similar observation may be made with regard to beasts of prey. They do not cohabit when they are in human captivity. The group that has lost control of its own affairs thus continues to weaken and to disintegrate until it perishes. Duration belongs to God alone. This may be illustrated by the Persian nation. In the past, the Persians filled the world with their great numbers. When their military force was annihilated in the days of the Arabs, they were still very numerous. It is said that Sadi, b. Abi Wakwaz, counted the population beyond Ktazifo. It numbered 137,000 individuals, with 37,000 heads of families. But when the Persians came under the rule of the Arabs and were made subject to oppression by force, they lasted only a short while and were wiped out as if they had never been. One should not think that this was the result of some specific persecution or aggression perpetrated against them. The rule of Islam is known for its justice. Such disintegration as befell the Persians is in human nature. It happens when people lose control of their own affairs and become the instrument of someone else. Therefore, the Negro nations are, as a rule, submissive to slavery, because Negroes have little that is essentially human and have attributes that are quite similar to those of dumb animals, as we have stated 137. Or 138. There are those who by accepting slavery hope to obtain high rank or to get money or power. This was the case with the Turks in the East, and with the Galician infidels and European Christians in Spain. Such people are customarily claimed by the dynasty for itself. Thus, they are not ashamed to be slaves, because they hope to be chosen for high position by the dynasty. And God knows better. 24. Arabs can gain control only over flat territory. This 138 is because, on account of their savage nature, the Arabs are people who plunder and cause damage. They plunder whatever they are able to lay their hands on without having to fight or to expose themselves to danger. They then retreat to their pastures in the desert. They do not attack or fight except in self-defense. Every stronghold or locality that seems difficult to attack, they bypass in favor of some less difficult enterprise. They do not attack it. Tribes that are protected against the Arabs by inaccessible mountains are safe from their mischief and destructiveness. The Arabs would not cross hills or undergo hardship and danger in order to get to them. Flat territory, on the other hand, falls victim to their looting and prey to their appetite whenever they have the opportunity of gaining power over it, when there is no militia, or when the dynasty is weak. Then they raid, plunder, and attack that territory repeatedly, because it is easily accessible to them. Eventually, its inhabitants succumb utterly to the Arabs, and then they are pushed around by them in accordance with changes of control and shifts in leadership. Eventually, their civilization is wiped out. God has power over his creatures. 25. Places that succumb to the Arabs are quickly ruined. The 139 reason for this is that the Arabs are a savage nation, fully accustomed to savagery and the things that cause it. Savagery has become their character and nature. They enjoy it, because it means freedom from authority and no subservience to leadership. Such a natural disposition is the negation and antithesis of civilization. All the customary activities of the Arabs lead to travel and movement. This is the antithesis and negation of stationariness, which produces civilization. For instance, the Arabs need stones to set them up as supports for their cooking pots. So, they take them from buildings which they tear down to get the stones, and use them for that purpose. Wood, too, is needed by them for props for their tents and for use as tent poles for their dwellings. So, they tear down roofs to get the wood for that purpose. The very nature of their existence is the negation of building, which is the basis of civilization. This is the case with them quite generally. Furthermore, it is their nature to plunder whatever other people possess. Their sustenance lies wherever the shadow of their lances falls. They recognize no limit in taking the possessions of other people. Whenever their eyes fall upon some property, furnishings, or utensils, they take it. When they acquire superiority and royal authority, they have complete power to plunder, as they please. There no longer exists any political power to protect property, and civilization is ruined. Furthermore, since they use force to make craftsmen and professional workers do their work, they do not see any value in it and do not pay them for it. Now, as we shall mention, 140 labor is the real basis of profit. When labor is not appreciated and is done for nothing, the hope for profit vanishes, and no productive work is done. The sedentary population disperses, and civilization decays. Furthermore, the Arabs are not concerned with laws. They are not concerned to deter people from misdeeds or to protect some against the others. They care only for the property that they might take away from people through looting and imposts. When they have obtained that, they have no interest in anything further, such as taking care of people, looking after their interests, or forcing them not to commit misdeeds. They often level fines on property, because they want to get some advantage, some tax, or profit out of it. This is their custom. It does not help to prevent misdeeds or to deter those who undertake to commit misdeeds. On the contrary, it increases misdeeds, because as compared to getting what one wants, the possible financial loss through fines is insignificant. 141 Under the rule of the Arabs, the subjects live as in a state of anarchy, without law. Anarchy destroys mankind and ruins civilization, since, as we have stated, the existence of royal authority is a natural quality of man. It alone guarantees their existence and social organization. That was mentioned above at the beginning of the chapter 142. Furthermore, every Arab is eager to be the leader. Scarcely a one of them would cede his power to another, even to his father, his brother, or the eldest, most important, member of his family. That happens only in rare cases and under pressure of considerations of decency. There are numerous authorities and emirs among them. The subjects have to obey many masters in connection with the control of taxation and law. Civilization, thus, decays and is wiped out. Abd al-Malik asked one Arab who had come to him on an embassy about al-Hajjaj. He wanted him to praise al-Hajjaj for his good political leadership, for the benefit of civilization. But the Arab said, when I left him, he was acting unjustly all by himself. 142. It is noteworthy how civilization always collapsed in places the Arabs took over and conquered, and how such settlements were depopulated and the very earth there turned into something that was no longer earth. The Yemen where the Arabs live is in ruins, except for a few cities. Persian civilization in the Arab Iraq is likewise completely ruined. The same applies to contemporary Syria. When the Bor Hilal and the Bor Salam pushed through, from their homeland, to Ifriqiya and the Maghrib in the beginning of the 5th, 11th century and struggled there for 350 years, they attached themselves to the country. And the flat territory in the Maghrib was completely ruined. Formerly, the whole region between the Sudan and the Mediterranean had been settled. This fact is attested by the relics of civilization there, such as monuments, architectural sculpture, and the visible remains of villages and hamlets. God inherits the earth and whomever is upon it. He is the best heir. 143. 26. Arabs can obtain royal authority only by making use of some religious coloring, such as prophecy, or sainthood, or some great religious event in general. The 144 reason for this is that because of their savagery, the Arabs are the least willing of nations to subordinate themselves to each other, as they are rude, proud, ambitious, and eager to be the leader. Their individual aspirations rarely coincide. But when there is religion among them, through prophecy or sainthood, then they have some restraining influence in themselves. The qualities of haughtiness and jealousy leave them. It is, then, easy for them to subordinate themselves and to unite, as a social organization. This is achieved by the common religion they now have. It causes rudeness and pride to disappear and exercises a restraining influence on their mutual envy and jealousy. When there is a prophet or saint among them, who calls upon them to fulfill the commands of God and rids them of blameworthy qualities and causes them to adopt praiseworthy ones, and who has them concentrate all their strength in order to make the truth prevail, they become fully united, as a social organization, and obtain superiority and royal authority. Besides, no people are as quick as the Arabs to accept religious truth and right guidance, because their natures have been preserved free from distorted habits and uncontaminated by base character qualities. The only difficulty lies in the quality of savagery, which, however, is easily taken care of and which is ready to admit good qualities, as it has remained in its first natural state and remote from the ugly customs and bad habits that leave their impress upon the soul. Every infant is born in the natural state, as is stated in the tradition that was quoted above. 145. 27. The Arabs are of all nations the one most remote from royal leadership. The 146 reason for this is that the Arabs are more rooted in desert life and penetrate deeper into the desert than any other nation. They have less need of the products and grain of the hills, because they are used to a tough and hard life. Therefore, they can dispense with other people. It is difficult for them to subordinate themselves to each other, because they are used to no control, and because they are in a state of savagery. Their leader needs them mostly for the group spirit that is necessary for purposes of defense. He is, therefore, forced to rule them kindly and to avoid antagonizing them. Otherwise, he would have trouble with the group spirit, and such trouble would be his undoing and theirs. Royal leadership and government, on the other hand, require the leader to exercise a restraining influence by force. If not, his leadership would not last. Furthermore, as we have stated before, 147, it is the nature of the Arabs, not only to appropriate the possessions of other people but, beyond that, to refrain from exercising any power of arbitration among them and to fail to keep them from fighting each other. When they have taken possession of a nation, they make it the goal of their rule to profit from their position by taking away the property of the members of that nation. Beyond that, they do not care to exercise any power of arbitration among them. They often punish crimes by fines on property, in their desire to increase the tax revenues and to obtain some pecuniary advantage. That is no deterrent to crime. Rather, it is often an incentive to crime, in view of the fact that incentives to commit misdeeds may be very strong, and that, in the opinion of the criminal, payment of a fine is insignificant, weighed against getting what he wants. Thus, misdeeds increase, and civilization is ruined. A nation dominated by the Arabs is in a state no different from anarchy, where everybody is set against the others. Such a civilization cannot last and goes quickly to ruins, as would be the case in a state of anarchy, as we have mentioned before. For all these reasons, the Arabs are by nature remote from royal leadership. They attain it only once their nature has undergone a complete transformation under the influence of some religious coloring that wipes out all such qualities, and causes the Arabs to have a restraining influence on themselves and to keep people apart from each other, as we have mentioned 148. This is illustrated by the Arab dynasty in Islam. Religion cemented their leadership with the religious law and its ordinances, which, explicitly and implicitly, are concerned with what is good for civilization. The caliphs followed one after another. As a result, the royal authority and government of the Arabs became great and strong. When Rustam saw the Muslims assemble for prayer, he said, "Yuma eats my liver. He teaches the dogs how to behave." 149. Later on, the Arabs were cut off from the dynasty for generations. They neglected the religion. Thus, they forgot political leadership and returned to their desert. They were ignorant of the connection of their group feeling with the people of the ruling dynasty, because subservience and lawful government had, now, become strange to them. They became once again as savage as they had been before. The epithet royal was no longer applicable to them, except in so far as it continued to apply to the caliphs who were Arabs by race. When the caliphate disappeared and was wiped out, governmental power passed altogether out of their hands. Non-Arabs took over the power in their stead. They remained as Bedouins in the desert, ignorant of royal authority and political leadership. Most Arabs do not even know that they possessed royal authority in the past, or that no nation had ever exercised such sweeping royal authority as had their race. The dynasties of Ad and Thermilde, the Amalekites, the Himyar, and the Tubas testify to that statement, and then, there was the Muda dynasty in Islam, the Umayyads and the Abbasids. But when the Arabs forgot the religion, they no longer had any connection with political leadership, and they returned to their desert origins. At times, they achieve superiority over weak dynasties, as is the case in the contemporary Maghreb. But their domination leads only to the ruin of the civilization they conquer, as we have stated before. God is the best. 150. 28. Desert tribes and groups are dominated by the urban population. It 151 has been stated by us before 152 that desert civilization is inferior to urban civilization, because not all the necessities of civilization are to be found among the people of the desert. They do possess some agriculture at home, but they do not possess all the materials that belong to it, most of which depend on crafts. They do not have any carpenters, tailors, blacksmiths, or other craftsmen whose crafts would provide them with the necessities required for making a living in agriculture and other things. Likewise, they do not have coined money, dinars and dirhams. They have the equivalent of it in harvested grain, in animals, and in animal products such as milk, wool of animals, camels, hair, and hides, which the urban population needs and pays the Arabs money for. However, while the Bedouins need the cities for their necessities of life, the urban population needs the Bedouins for conveniences and luxuries. Thus, the Bedouins need the cities for the necessities of life by the very nature of their mode of existence. As long as they live in the desert and have not obtained royal authority and control of the cities, they need the inhabitants of the latter. They must be active in behalf of their interests and obey them whenever the latter ask and demand obedience from them. When there is a ruler in the city, the submissiveness and obedience of the Bedouins is the result of the superiority of the ruler. When there is no ruler in the city, some political leadership and control by some of the inhabitants over the remainder must, of necessity, exist in it. If not, the civilization of the city would be wiped out. Such a leader makes the Bedouins obey him and exert themselves in behalf of his interests. He does so either by persuasion, in that he distributes money among them and lets them have the necessities they need from his city, which enables their civilization to subsist, or, if he has the power to do so, he forces them to obey him. Even if he has to cause discord among them so as to get the support of one party, with the help of which he will then be able to overcome the remainder and thus force the others to obey him, since they fear the decay of their civilization as the result of the unstable situation. These Bedouins often cannot leave the particular districts where they live and go to other regions, because all of them are already inhabited by other Bedouins who took them away from someone and kept others out. They have, therefore, no hope of survival except by being obedient to the city. Thus, they are of necessity dominated by the urban population. God exercises forceful domination over his servants. 153. Chapter 3. On dynasties, royal authority, the caliphate, government ranks, and all that goes with these things. The chapter contains basic and supplementary propositions. 1. Royal authority and large one dynastic power are attained only through a group and group feeling. This too is because, as we established in the first chapter, aggressive and defensive strength is obtained only through group feeling, which means mutual affection and willingness to fight and die for each other. Now, royal authority is a noble and enjoyable position. It comprises all the good things of the world, the pleasures of the body, and the joys of the soul. Therefore, there is, as a rule, great competition for it. It rarely is handed over voluntarily, but it may be taken away. Thus, discord ensues. It leads to war and fighting, and to attempts to gain superiority. Nothing of all this comes about except through group feeling, as we have also mentioned. This situation is not at all understood by the great mass. They forget it, because they have forgotten the time when the dynasty first became established. They have grown up in settled areas for a long time. They have lived there for successive generations. Thus, they know nothing about what took place with God's help at the beginning of the dynasty. They merely notice that the coloring of the men of the dynasty is determined, that people have submitted to them, and that group feeling is no longer needed to establish their power. They do not know how it was at the beginning and what difficulties had to be overcome by the founder of the dynasty. The inhabitants of Spain especially have forgotten group feeling and its influence, because so long a time has passed, and because as a rule they have no need of the power of group feeling, since their country has been annihilated and is depleted of tribal groups. God has power to do what he wishes. 2. When a dynasty is firmly established, it can dispense with group feeling. The three reason for this is that people find it difficult to submit to large dynastic power at the beginning, unless they are forced into submission by strong superiority. The new government is something strange. People are not familiar with, or used to, its rule. But once leadership is firmly vested in the members of the family qualified to exercise royal authority in the dynasty, and once royal authority has been passed on by inheritance over many generations and through successive dynasties, the beginnings are forgotten. And the members of that family are clearly marked as leaders. It has become a firmly established article of faith that one must be subservient and submissive to them. People will fight with them in their behalf, as they would fight for the articles of faith. By this time, the rulers will not need much group feeling to maintain their power. It is as if obedience to the government were a divinely revealed book that cannot be changed or opposed. It is for some good reason that the discussion of the imamate is placed at the end of works dealing with the articles of faith, as if it were one of them, for the rulers maintain their hold over the government and their own dynasty with the help, then, either of clients and followers who grew up in the shadow and power 5 of group feeling, or, with that, of tribal groups of a different descent who have become their clients. Something of the sort happened to the Abbasids. The group feeling of the Arabs had been destroyed by the time of the reign of Al-Mutasim and his son, Al-Wathiq. They tried to maintain their hold over the government thereafter with the help of Persian, Turkish, Dalim, Seljuk, and other clients. Then, the Persians, non-Arabs, and clients gained power over the provinces of the realm. The influence of the dynasty grew smaller, and no longer extended beyond the environs of Baghdad. Eventually, the Dalim closed in upon that area, and took possession of it. The caliphs were ruled by them. Then, the Dalim, in turn, lost control. The Seljuks seized power after the Dalim, and the caliphs were ruled by them. Then, the Seljuks, in turn, lost control. Finally, the Tartars closed in. They killed the caliph and wiped out every vestige of the dynasty. The same happened to the Sahajah in the Maghrib. Their group feeling was destroyed in the 5th, 11th century, or before that. Dynastic power, but of decreasing importance, was maintained by them in Al-Mawdiyah, in Bougie, in Al-Kuala, 6 and in the other frontier cities of Ifriqiya. Frequently, some rival aspirant to royal authority would attack these frontier cities and entrench himself in them. Yet, they retained government and royal authority until God permitted their dynasty to be wiped out. Then the Almohads came, fortified by the strong group feeling among the Masmuda, and obliterated all traces of the Sahajah dynasty. The same happened to the Umayyad dynasty in Spain. When its Arab group feeling was destroyed, the Rais de Taifas, small princes, seized power and divided the territory among themselves. In competition with each other, they distributed among themselves the realm of the Umayyad dynasty. Each one of them seized the territory under his control and aggrandized himself. These rulers, learned of the relations that existed between the non-Arabs, in the east, and the Abbasids. Imitating them, they adopted royal surnames and used royal trappings. There was no danger that anyone would take the prerogatives they claimed away from them or alter the situation in this respect, because Spain was no longer the home of groups and tribes, as we shall mention. They went on in this way, and it was, as Ibn Sharaf 7 described it. What makes me feel humble in Spain is the use of the names Mutasim and Mutaddid there. Royal surnames not in their proper place. Like a cat that by blowing itself up imitates the lion. They tried to maintain their power with the help of clients and followers and with that of the Zata and other Berber tribes which infiltrated Spain from the African shore. They imitated the way the Umayyad dynasty in its last stages had tried to maintain its power with their help, when the Arab group feeling weakened and Ibn Emir 8 obtained control of the dynasty. These newcomers founded large states. Each one of them had control over a section of Spain. They also had a large share of royal authority, corresponding to that of the dynasty they had divided up. They thus remained in power until the Almoravids, who shared in the strong Lamchua group feeling, crossed the sea. The latter came and replaced and dislodged them from their centers. They obliterated all traces of the Rais d'États, who were unable to defend themselves because they had no longer any group feeling. Such group feeling makes it possible for a dynasty to become established and protected from the beginning. At-Turchi thought that the military strength of a dynasty as such is identical with the size of its army that receives a fixed pay every month. He mentioned this in his Siraj al-Muluk 9. His statement does not take into consideration the conditions obtaining at the original foundation of large dynasties. It applies only to the later stages, after the dynasty has been established and after royal authority has become firmly anchored in a given family and its people have adopted their definite coloring. At-Turchi had personal contact only with a senile dynasty whose energy was exhausted and which had reverted to maintaining power with the help of clients and followers, then hired servants for its defense. He had contact only with the small dynasties, the Rais d'États, at a time when the Umayyad dynasty was already in the state of complete dissolution, when its Arab group feeling was wiped out, and when each emir had independent control over his particular region. He lived under the administration of the Sariosas al-Musta in B. Hud and his son, al-Muzaffar. They had no longer any group feeling left, because, for 300 years, the Arabs had been dominated by luxury and had perished. At-Turchi thus saw only the kind of ruler who had independent control of royal authority to the exclusion of the families to which it belonged, and in whom the coloring of autocratic rule had been firmly established since the time of the dynasty's power, and when a remnant of group feeling still existed. Therefore, his royal authority was not contested, and he could rely for maintenance of his power upon a soldiery with fixed pay. At-Turchi generalized the condition observed by him when he made the statement mentioned. He did not realize how a dynasty originally comes to power, nor that only those who share in a group feeling are able to accomplish the formation of a dynasty. But this should be realized. It should be understood how God intended these things to be. God gives his kingdom, royal authority, to whomever he wants to give it. 10. 3. Members of a royal family may be able to found a dynasty that can dispense with group feeling. This is because the group feeling in which a member of a royal family shares may have much power over nations and races, and the inhabitants of remote regions who support his power may be obedient to that family and submissive. So, when such a person secedes, leaving the seat of his rule and the home of his might, and joins those inhabitants of remote regions, they adopt him. They support his rule and help him. They take care of establishing his dynasty on a firm basis. They hope that he will be confirmed in his family rights, and take the power away from his kinsmen. 11 They do not desire to share in any way in his rule, as they subject themselves to his group feeling and submit to the coloring of material superiority firmly belonging to him and his people. They believe, as in an article of faith, in being obedient to him and his people. Were they to desire to share his rule with him or to rule without him, the earth would be shaken. 12. That is what happened to the Idrisids in Morocco and the Ubaidid, Fatimids, in Iphriqiya and Egypt. Abu Talib's descendants had left the east and removed themselves from the seat of the caliphate, to go to remote regions of the Muslim realm. They aspired to deprive the Abbasids of the caliphate whose coloring had, throughout the years, firmly established itself in the descendants of Abdmaf, first among the Umayyads and then among the Hashemids, Abbasids. They seceded from the ruling Abbasid dynasty in the western part of Islam and made propaganda for themselves. The Berbers supported their rule time after time. The Araba and Magila supported the Idrisids, and the Kutamor, the Sahaja, and the Hawara supported the Ubaidid, Fatimids. These Berber tribes cemented the dynasties of the Idrisids and Ubaidids, and firmly established their rule through the group support they gave them. They detached the whole Maghrib and then Iphriqiya from the realm of the Abbasids. The influence of the Abbasid dynasty grew steadily smaller and that of the Ubaidid, Fatimids, larger. Eventually, the latter took possession of Egypt, Syria, and the Hijaz, and shared the Muslim empire half and half with the Abbasids. 12 And nonetheless, the Berbers who supported the dynasty submitted their own affairs to the Ubaidid, Fatimids, and obeyed their rule. They merely vied for positions under them. They subjected themselves to the royal authority that had become the established coloring of the Hashemids, the family of Muhammad, the Alid Fatimids as well as the Abbasids, and to the superiority over all nations of the Quraysh and the Muda. Royal authority, therefore, remained with their descendants down to the time of the complete destruction of Arab rule. God decides, and no one can change his decision. 13. 4. Dynasties of wide power and large royal authority have their origin in religion based either on prophecy or on truthful propaganda. This 14 is because royal authority results from superiority. Superiority results from group feeling. Only by God's help in establishing his religion do individual desires come together in agreement to press their claims, and hearts become united. God said, if you had expended all the treasures on earth, you would have achieved no unity among them. 15 The secret of this is that when the hearts succumb to false desires and are inclined toward the world, mutual jealousy and widespread differences arise. But, when they are turned toward the truth and reject the world and whatever is false, and advance toward God, they become one in their outlook. Jealousy disappears. There are few differences. Mutual cooperation and support flourish. As a result, the extent of the state widens, and the dynasty grows, as we shall explain now. 5. Religious propaganda gives a dynasty at its beginning another power in addition to that of the group feeling it possessed as the result of the number of its supporters. As 16 we have mentioned before, The reason for this is that religious coloring does away with mutual jealousy and envy among people who share in a group feeling, and causes concentration upon the truth. When people, who have a religious coloring, come to have the right insight into their affairs, nothing can withstand them, because their outlook is one and their object one of common accord. They are willing to die for their objectives. On the other hand, the members of the dynasty they attack may be many times as numerous as they. But their purposes differ, inasmuch as they are false 17 purposes, and the people of the worldly dynasty come to abandon each other, since they are afraid of death. Therefore, they do not offer resistance to the people with a religious coloring, even if they themselves are more numerous. They are overpowered by them and quickly wiped out, as a result of the luxury and humbleness existing among them, as we have mentioned before 18. This happened to the Arabs at the beginning of Islam during the Muslim conquests. The armies of the Muslims at Al-Qadisiyah and at the Yarmouk numbered some 30,000 in each case, while the Persian troops at Al-Qadisiyah numbered 120,000, 19, and the troops of Heraclius, according to Al-Waqidi, 400,000.20. Neither of the two parties was able to withstand the Arabs. The Arabs routed them and seized what they possessed. Another illustration is the Lamchua, or Maravid, and Almohad dynasties. In the Maghrib, there existed many tribes equaling or surpassing them in numbers and group feeling. However, their religious organization doubled the strength of their group feeling through their feeling of having the right religious insight 21 and their willingness to die, as we have stated, and nothing could withstand them. This can also be illustrated by the situation existing at the time, when the religious coloring changes and is destroyed. The power of the ruling dynasty is then wiped out. Superiority exists then merely in proportion to the existing group feeling, without the additional power of religion. As a result, the dynasty is overpowered by those groups, up to this time, under its control, that are equal or superior to it in strength. It had formerly overpowered the groups that had a stronger group feeling and were more deeply rooted in desert life, with the help of the additional power that religion had given it. An illustration of this is the relationship of the Almohads with the Zata. The Zata were deeply rooted in the desert and more savage than the Masmuda, but the Masmuda had the religious call to follow the Mordai. They took on his religious coloring. As a result, the strength of their group feeling increased many times over. Therefore, they were at first able to overpower the Zata and to make them their followers, even though the Zata were more strongly rooted in the desert and had a stronger group feeling than they. But, later on, when the Masmuda lost their religious coloring, the Zata rose up against them from every side and took their power away from them. God has the power to execute his 22 commands. 6. Religious propaganda cannot materialize without group feeling. This 23 is because, as we have mentioned before, every mass, political, undertaking by necessity requires group feeling. This is indicated in the aforementioned 24 tradition. God sent no prophet who did not enjoy the protection of his people. If this was the case with the prophets, who are among human beings those most likely to perform wonders, one would expect it to apply, all the more so to others. One cannot expect them to be able to work the wonder of achieving superiority without group feeling. It happened to the Sufi Sheikh Ibn Qazi, 25, the author of the Kitab Al-Analay on Sufism. He rose in revolt in Spain and made propaganda for the truth shortly before the time when the propaganda of the Mordai, of the Almohads, started. His followers were called Al-Murabatu 26. Ibn Qazi had some success, because the Lamchua, or Muravids, were preoccupied with their own difficulties with the Almohads. But there were no groups and tribes there to defend him. When the Almohads took over control of the Maghrib, he soon obeyed them and participated in their cause. He took the oath of allegiance to them at his stronghold, the fortress of Arcos, de la Frontera. He handed his frontier province over to them and became their first missionary in Spain. His revolt was called the Revolt of the Murabatu. To this chapter belong cases of revolutionaries from among the common people and of jurists who undertake to reform evil practices. Many religious people who follow the ways of religion come to revolt against unjust emirs. They call for a change in, and prohibition of, evil practices, and for good practices. They hope for a divine reward for what they do. They gain many followers and sympathizers among the great mass of the people, but they risk being killed, and most of them actually do perish in consequence of their activities as sinners and unrewarded, because God had not destined them for such activities as they undertake. He commands such activities to be undertaken only where there exists the power to bring them to a successful conclusion. Muhammad said, "Should one among you see evil activities, he should change them with his hand. If he cannot do that, he should change them with his tongue. And if he cannot do that, he should change them with his heart." 26. Rulers and dynasties are strongly entrenched. Their foundations can be undermined and destroyed only through strong efforts backed by the group feeling of tribes and families, as we have mentioned before. Similarly, prophets in their religious propaganda depended on groups and families, though they were the ones who could have been supported by God with anything in existence, if he had wished, but in his wisdom 27 he permitted matters to take their customary course. If someone who is on the right path were to attempt religious reforms in this way, his isolation would keep him from gaining the support of group feeling 28 and he would perish. If someone merely pretends to achieve religious reforms in order to gain political leadership, he deserves to be hampered by obstacles and to fall victim to perdition. Religious reforms are a divine matter that materializes only with God's pleasure and support, through sincere devotion for him and in view of good intentions towards the Muslims. No Muslim, no person of insight, could doubt this truth. In Islam, the first person to start that sort of thing in Baghdad was a certain Khalid ad-Dariush 29. He had revolted. Al-Amin was killed. Al-Mamu in Khurasan was slowed down in his advance toward the Iraq, and he appointed Ali b. Musa al-Rida, a descendant of al-Huzay, successor to the throne. The Abbasids showed their disapproval of that move. They banded together in order to revolt and to renounce obedience to al-Mamu and to choose someone else in his stead. Allegiance was sworn to Ibrahim b. al-Mawdi. Trouble broke out in Baghdad. The troublesome elements among the underworld and the soldiery were given a free hand against the decent citizens. They robbed the people and filled their pockets with loot, which they sold openly in the markets. The inhabitants turned for protection to the authorities, but these did not help them. The religious and good citizens, thereupon, united in order to stop the criminals and to put an end to their misdeeds. At that moment, a man named Khalid ad-Dariush appeared in Baghdad. He appealed to the people to obey the law. Many responded to his call. They fought the troublesome elements and defeated them. Khalid had them beaten and punished. After him, there appeared another man from among the populace of Baghdad, 30 by name Abu Hatim Salbi Salamar al-Asari. He hung a copy of the Qur'an around his neck, and appealed to the people to obey the law and to act in accordance with the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet. High and low, Hashemites and others, all followed him. He established himself in the palace of Tahi and took over the government office. He went about Baghdad, kept out all those who were frightening wayfarers, and put an end to the payment of protection money 31 to the underworld. When Khalid ad-Dariush said to him that he, Khalid, was not against the government, Sul replied that he, for his part, was fighting all those who acted contrary to the Quran and the Sunnah, whoever they might be. This happened in the year 201, 817. Ibrahim b. al-Mawdi sent an army against Sul. He was defeated and captured, and his power quickly dissolved. He barely escaped with his life. Later on, many deluded individuals followed that example. They took it upon themselves to establish the truth. They did not know that they would need group feeling for that. They did not realize how their enterprise must necessarily end and what they would come to. With respect to such people, it is necessary to adopt one of the following courses. One may either treat them, if they are insane, or one may punish them either by execution or beatings when they cause trouble, or one may ridicule them and treat them as buffoons. 32. Some of these people allied themselves with the expected Fatimid. 33. They pretended to be, either he himself, or one of his missionaries, despite their ignorance of everything concerning the Fatimid. Most men who adopt such ideas will be found to be, either deluded and crazy, or to be swindlers who, with the help of such claims, seek to obtain political leadership which they crave and would be unable to obtain in the natural manner. They believe that such claims will be instrumental in bringing to them the fulfillment of their hopes. They do not consider the disaster that will overtake them in consequence. The trouble they create will speedily cause their death and bring their trickery to a bitter end. At the beginning of this century, a man of Sufi leanings, by name At-Tuwaizari, appeared in As-Sus. He went to the Mosque of Masur 34 on the shore of the Mediterranean and pretended to be the expected Fatimid. He was taking advantage of the common people's firm belief in predictions to the effect that the Fatimid was about to appear and that his mission would originate at that mosque. A number of ordinary Berber groups were attracted to him like moths to the flame. 35. Their chiefs then feared that the revolt might spread. The leader of the Masmuda at that time, Umar as-Saksawi, 36, secretly sent someone to him, who killed him in his bed. Also at the beginning of this century, a man known as Al-Abbas appeared among the Gumarat. He made a similar claim. The lowest among the stupid and imbecile members of those tribes followed his blethering. He marched on Badis, one of the Gumarat cities, and entered it by force. He was then killed, 40 days after the start of his mission. He perished like those before him. 37. There are many similar cases. 38. The mistake they all make is that they disregard the significance of group feeling for success in such matters. If deceit is involved, it is better that such a person should not succeed and be made to pay for his crime. That is the sinner's reward. 39. 7. Each dynasty has a certain amount of provinces and lands, and no more. The 40 reason for this is that the group to which a given dynasty belongs and the people who support and establish it, must of necessity be distributed over the provinces and border regions which they reach and take into possession. Only thus is it possible to protect them against enemies and to enforce the laws of the dynasty relative to the collection of taxes, restrictions, 41 and other things. When the various groups have spread over the border regions and provinces, their numbers are necessarily exhausted. This, then, is the time when the territory of the dynasty has reached its farthest extension, where the border regions form a belt around the center of the realm. If the dynasty then undertakes to expand beyond its holdings, its widening territory remains without military protection and is laid open to any chance attack by enemy or neighbor. This has the detrimental result for the dynasty of the creation of boldness toward it and of diminished respect for it. On the other hand, if the group is a very large one and its numbers are not exhausted when distributed over border regions and territories, the dynasty retains the strength to go beyond the limit so far reached, until its expansion has gone as far as possible. The natural reason for this situation lies in the fact that the power of group feeling is one of the natural powers. Any power resulting in any kind of action must proceed in its action in such manner. 42. A dynasty is stronger at its center than it is at its border regions. When it has reached its farthest expansion, it becomes too weak and incapable to go any farther. This may be compared to light rays that spread from their centers, or to circles that widen over the surface of the water when something strikes it. When the dynasty becomes senile and weak, it begins to crumble at its extremities. The center remains intact until God permits the destruction of the whole dynasty. Then, the center is destroyed. But when a dynasty is overrun from the center, it is of no avail to it that the outlying areas remain intact. It dissolves all at once. The center is like the heart from which the vital spirit 43 spreads. Were the heart to be overrun and captured, all the extremities would be routed. This may be observed in the Persian dynasty. Its center was Al-Madain, Ctesiphore. When the Muslims took over Al-Madain, the whole Persian Empire dissolved. Possession of the outlying provinces of the realm was of no avail to Yazdjad. Conversely, the center of the Byzantine dynasty in Syria was in Constantinople. When the Muslims took Syria away from the Byzantines, the latter repaired to their center in Constantinople. The loss of Syria did not harm them. Their rule continued there without interruption until God permitted it to be ended. 44. Another example is the situation of the Arabs at the beginning of Islam. Since they were a very large group, they very quickly overran neighboring Syria, Iraq, and Egypt. Then, they kept on going into western India, Asid, Abyssinia, Ifriqiya, and the Maghrib, and later into Spain. They spread over many provinces and border regions, and settled in them as militiamen. Their numbers were exhausted by that expansion. No further conquests could be made by them, and the Muslim Empire reached its farthest extension. Those borders were not passed, but the dynasty receded from them, until God permitted it to be destroyed. The situation of later dynasties was the same. Each dynasty depended on the numerical strength of its supporters. When its numbers were exhausted through expansion, no further conquest or extension of power was possible. This is how God proceeds with his creatures. 8. The greatness of a dynasty, the extent of its territory, and the length of its duration depend upon the numerical strength of its supporters. The reason for this is that royal authority exists only through group feeling. Representatives of group feeling are the militiamen who settle in the provinces and territories of the dynasty and are spread over them. The more numerous the tribes and groups of a large dynasty are, the stronger and larger are its provinces and lands. Their royal authority, therefore, is wider. An example of this was the Muslim dynasty when God united the power of the Arabs in Islam. The number of Muslims who participated in the raid against Tabuk, the Prophet's last raid, was 110,045, consisting of Muda and Qa'tai horsemen and foot soldiers. That number was augmented by those who became Muslims after the raid, and down to the time of the Prophet's death. When all these people then set out to seek for themselves the royal authority held by other nations, there was no protection against them or refuge. They were allowed to take possession of the realms of the Persians and the Byzantines, who were the greatest dynasties in the world at that time, as well as the realms of the Turks in the east, of the European Christians and Berbers in the west, Maghrib, and of the Goths in Spain. They went from the Hijaz to As-Sus in the far west, 46, and from the Yemen to the Turks in the farthest north. They gained possession of all 7 zones. One may also look at the Sahaja and Almohad dynasties and their relationship to the Ubaydid, Fatimids, before them. The Kutimur, supporters of the Ubaydid, Fatimid, dynasty, were more numerous than the Sahaja and the Mazmuda. Consequently, their dynasty was larger. They took possession of Ifriqiya and the Maghrib, as well as of Syria, Egypt, and the Hijaz. One may also look at the later Zata dynasty. Since the number of the Zata was smaller than that of the Mazmudda, their royal authority fell short of that of the Almohads, because the Zata were numerically inferior to the Mazmudda from the very start. One may also consider the situation of the 2 Zata dynasties at this time, the Mirids and the Abdalwadids. The Mirids were numerically stronger than the Abdalwadids when they first seized power. Therefore, their dynasty was stronger and larger than that of the Abdalwadids. Time after time, the Mirids defeated the Abdalwadids. It is said that the number of the Mirids at the beginning of their rule was 3,000 and that of the Abdalwadids 1,000. However, possession of dynastic power with its life of ease and the great number of its followers increased their numbers. Thus, the expansion and power of a dynasty correspond to the numerical strength of those who obtain superiority at the beginning of the rule. The length of its duration also depends upon it. The life of anything that comes into being depends upon the strength of its temper. The temper of dynasties is based upon group feeling. If the group feeling is strong, the dynasty's temper likewise is strong, and its life of long duration. Group feeling, in turn, depends on numerical strength, as we have stated. 47. The real reason why large dynasties last longer is that when collapse comes it begins in the outlying regions, and the large dynasty has many such provinces far from its center. Each defection that occurs necessarily requires a certain time. The time required for collapse of the dynasty will be long in such cases, because there are many provinces, each of which collapses in its own good time. The duration of a large dynasty, therefore, is long. This fact may be observed in the Arab Muslim dynasty. It lasted the longest of all Muslim dynasties, counting both the Abbasids in the center and the Umayyads far away in Spain. Their rule collapsed only after the 4th, 10th century. 48. The Ubaydid, Fatimids, lasted about 280 years. The Sahaja dynasty did not last as long as that of the Ubaydid, Fatimids, namely, from the time when Ma'ad al-Mu'izz entrusted Ifriqiya to Balughi b. Zurt in the year 358, 969, up to the time when the Almohads took possession of Al-Qulah 49 and Bougie in the year 557, 1162. The contemporary Almohad, Hafsid, dynasty has lasted nearly 270 years. Thus, the life of a dynasty depends upon the number of its supporters. This is how God formerly proceeded with his servants. 50. 9. A dynasty rarely establishes itself firmly in lands with many different tribes and groups. The 51 reason for this is the differences in opinions and desires. Behind each opinion and desire, there is a group feeling defending it. At any time, therefore, there is much opposition to a dynasty and rebellion against it, even if the dynasty possesses group feeling, because each group feeling under the control of the ruling dynasty thinks that it has in itself enough strength and power. One may compare what has happened in this connection in Africa and the Maghrib from the beginning of Islam to the present time. The inhabitants of those lands are Berber tribes and groups. The first victory of Ibn Isara 52 over them and the European Christians, in the Maghrib, was of no avail. They continued to rebel and apostatized time after time. The Muslims massacred many of them. After the Muslim religion had been established among them, they went on revolting and seceding, and they adopted dissident, Kharijite, religious opinions many times. Ibn Izid 53 said that the Berbers in the Maghrib revolted 12 times and that Islam became firmly established among them only during the governorship of Muzi b. Uzi and thereafter. This is what is meant by the statement reported on the authority of Umar, that Africa divides 54 the hearts of its inhabitants. The statement refers to the great number of tribes and groups there, which causes them to be disobedient and unmanageable. The Iraq at that time was different, and so was Syria. The militia of the Iraq and Syria consisted of Persians and Byzantines, respectively. All the inhabitants were a mixed lot of town and city dwellers. When the Muslims deprived them of their power, there remained no one capable of making a defense or of offering opposition. The Berber tribes in the west are innumerable. All of them are Bedouins and members of groups and families. Whenever one tribe is destroyed, another takes its place and is as refractory and rebellious as the former one had been. Therefore, it has taken the Arabs a long time to establish their dynasty in the land of Africa and the Maghrib. The same was the case in Syria in the age of the Israelites. At that time, there existed, there, a very large number of tribes with a great variety of group feelings, such as the tribes of Palestine and Canaan, the children of Esau, the Midianites, the children of Lot, the Edomites, the Armenians, the Amalekites, Girgasites, and the Nabateans from the Jazira and Mosul 55. Therefore, it was difficult for the Israelites to establish their dynasty firmly. Time after time, their royal authority was endangered. The spirit of opposition, alive in the country, communicated itself to the Israelites. They opposed their own government and revolted against it. They thus never had a continuous and firmly established royal authority. Eventually they were overpowered, first by the Persians, then by the Greeks, and finally by the Romans, when their power came to an end in the diaspora. God has the power to execute his commands. 56. On the other hand, it is easy to establish a dynasty in lands that are free from group feelings. Government there will be a tranquil affair, because seditions and rebellions are few, and the dynasty there does not need much group feeling. This is the case in contemporary Egypt and Syria. They are, now, free from tribes and group feelings. Indeed, one would never suspect that Syria had once been a mine of them, as we have just stated. Royal authority in Egypt is most peaceful and firmly rooted, because Egypt has few dissidents or people who represent tribal groups. Egypt has a sultan and subjects. Egypt's ruling dynasty consists of the Turkish rulers and their groups. They succeed each other in power, and the rule circulates among them, passing from one branch to another. The caliphate belongs in name to an Abbasid, a descendant of the Abbasid caliphs of Baghdad. The same is the case in contemporary Spain. The group feeling of the ruler of Spain, Ibn al-Umma, the Azrids of Granada, was not strong or widespread to begin with. The Azrids belonged to one of the Arab houses that had supported the Umayyad dynasty, a few survivors of which remained. This situation came about as follows: when the Spaniards were no longer ruled by the Arab dynasty of the Umayyads, and the Lamtar and Almohad Berbers became their rulers, they detested this domination. Their oppression weighed heavily upon them, and their hearts were full of hate and indignation against the new rulers. Near the end of the Almohad rule, the Almohad lords handed over many of their strongholds to the abominable Christian ruler, in order to gain his support for their attempts to capture the capital city of Marrakech. That caused remnants of the people in Spain who represented the ancient group feeling to unite. These were descendants of Arab houses who had to some degree kept away from urban civilization and the cities, and who were firmly rooted in military life. They included Ibn Had, of Saragossa, Ibn al-Umma, of Granada, and Ibn Mardaish, of Valencia and Murcia, and others like them. Ibn had seized power, made propaganda for the Abbasid Caliphate in the east, and caused the people to revolt against the Almohads. Allegiance to them was denounced, and they were driven out. Ibn Had thus became the independent ruler of Spain. Then, Ibn al-Umma rose to power and opposed Ibn Had's propaganda. He made propaganda for Ibn Hafs, the Almohad ruler of Ifriqiya, and seized power with the help of a group of relatives who were called the chiefs. He needed no more people than these, because there were so few groups in Spain, at that time, possessing a government, sultan, and subjects. Ibn al-Umma then sought support against the abominable Christian ruler, from Zata chieftains who came to him from across the sea. These Zata chieftains became his associates in defense of the frontier regions and the manning of the garrisons. Now, the Zata, Miriad, ruler of the Maghreb had hopes of gaining power in Spain. But these Zata chieftains who were Ibn al-Umma's associates defended him. His power, eventually, was firmly established. The people became used to his rule and could do nothing against him. He bequeathed his power to his descendants, who have held it down to the present. One should not think that he was without group support. This was not so. He started out with a group, but it was a small one. However, it was sufficient for his needs, because there were few groups and tribes in Spain, and, consequently, not much group feeling was needed there, in order to gain the upper hand over the Spaniards. God has no need of the worlds. 57.